I was a secretary they called incompetent until I leaked their tax fraud to the IRS. But that morning, as I watched Richardson's smug face deliver my termination, I had no idea I was about to become their worst nightmare. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile conference room, casting harsh shadows across the polished table where my career was being executed. Richardson sat across from me, his expensive suit wrinkled from what I assumed was another long night of creative accounting. His fingers drummed against a manila folder that I knew contained my fate. The human resources representative, a thin woman with nervous eyes, avoided my gaze as she slid the termination papers across the table. Her movements were rehearsed, mechanical. She'd done this before. The papers landed with a soft whisper against the wood, and I stared at them for a moment, processing the corporate language that essentially boiled down to, "You're fired." Richardson's mouth moved, forming words about performance standards and company restructuring, but I wasn't listening to his rehearsed speech. Instead, I watched his body language, the way his shoulders relaxed as he delivered the blow, the subtle smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth when he mentioned my so-called incompetence, the casual way he leaned back in his chair, as if dismissing 3 years of my life was just another Tuesday morning task. My hands remained steady as I signed the papers. I'd learned long ago that showing emotion in corporate environments was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Richardson watched me with those pale blue eyes, probably expecting tears or protests. Instead, I gave him nothing. Just my signature on the dotted line and a brief nod. The security guard who escorted me to my desk was apologetic in his silence. He stood a respectful distance away as I packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box. Family photos, a small cactus plant, the coffee mug my sister had given me for my birthday. The detritus of a professional life reduced to items that fit in a single box. As I cleaned out my desk drawers, muscle memory guided my hands to the locked filing cabinet beside my workspace. For 3 years, I'd been the gatekeeper of Richardson and Associates' financial documents. Every invoice, every receipt, every ledger entry had passed through my hands. I'd organized them, filed them, and maintained them with the precision that Richardson now claimed was incompetent. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same attention to detail that had made me indispensable had also made me inconvenient. I'd seen too much, knew too much, and asked too many questions about discrepancies that Richardson preferred to keep buried. But in that moment, packing my belongings under the watchful eye of security, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about my mortgage payment, my car insurance, my student loans. I was thinking about how I'd explain this to my family, how I'd update my resume, how I'd survive the gap between unemployment benefits and my next paycheck. It wasn't until I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, cardboard box in the passenger seat, that the rage began to build. Not the hot, explosive anger that demands immediate action, but the cold, calculating fury that settles in your chest and starts making plans. I drove home in silence, my mind already working through the implications of what I'd witnessed over the past 3 years. Richardson and Associates marketed themselves as a boutique accounting firm specializing in small business financial management. They promised personalized service, ethical practices, and competitive rates. What they actually delivered was a sophisticated tax evasion scheme that had been operating right under the noses of their clients and the IRS. I'd been the one who noticed the pattern first. Invoices that appeared in the system but never showed up in client files. Expenses that were claimed on multiple tax returns. Phantom employees who existed only on payroll records during tax season. When I'd brought these discrepancies to Richardson's attention, he'd dismissed them as clerical errors and suggested I focus on my filing rather than trying to understand the complexities of tax law. Now, sitting in my empty apartment with the cardboard box on my kitchen table, I understood why Richardson had been so eager to silence my questions. And I understood why my sudden termination had been necessary from his perspective. I was the only person in the office who had access to both the client files and the internal financial records. I was the only one who could see the full picture of what Richardson was doing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been fired for incompetence. I'd been fired because I was too competent, because I'd seen what Richardson didn't want me to see, and he couldn't risk me putting the pieces together. But it was too late for that. I'd already put the pieces together. I'd been putting them together for months, thinking I was just doing my job better, being more thorough, more attentive to detail. Instead, I'd been building a case against my own employer. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a comprehensive inventory of everything I'd observed, every discrepancy I'd noticed, every red flag I'd documented in my meticulous filing system. The list filled 3 pages of legal pad paper, written in my careful handwriting with dates, amounts, and specific details. Looking at that list, I felt something shift inside me. The victim mentality that had clouded my thinking since the morning's termination began to clear, replaced by something sharper and more focused. I wasn't just a dismissed secretary anymore. I was a witness to federal tax fraud, and I had the documentation to prove it. The next morning, I called Richardson's office. The receptionist who answered was someone I'd trained, a young woman named Jessica who'd always been friendly and respectful. When she heard my voice, there was genuine surprise and concern in her tone. She asked how I was doing, if I'd found another job yet, if there was anything she could do to help. I told her I was fine, that I'd left some personal files in my desk and needed to retrieve them. Would it be possible to come in during lunch when Richardson was out? Jessica hesitated for a moment, then agreed. She'd make sure I had 15 minutes alone at my old desk. The building felt different when I walked through the lobby that afternoon. The security guard was the same one who'd escorted me out the day before, but now he seemed suspicious rather than apologetic. He watched me sign in, noted the time, and made a point of mentioning that I had 15 minutes before he'd need to escort me back out. Jessica met me at the elevator, and I could see the discomfort in her posture. She'd been told to supervise my visit, to make sure I didn't access anything I shouldn't. But Jessica had always respected my work, and she gave me the space I needed while still maintaining her professional obligations. My old desk looked exactly as I'd left it, cleared of personal items but still bearing the faint impressions of my 3-year tenure. I sat in my chair one last time and opened the desk drawers, pretending to search for personal files while actually confirming that my copies of the suspicious documents were still where I'd left them. Richardson had been thorough in his termination process, but not thorough enough. He'd removed my access to the digital filing system and collected my keys to the locked cabinets, but he'd overlooked the fact that I'd been making backup copies of problematic documents for months. Not because I was planning anything, but because I'd been genuinely concerned about data loss and wanted to ensure business continuity. Those backup copies were still in my desk drawer, tucked inside a folder labeled Office Supplies Inventory. Richardson had probably seen the folder during his cleanup, but hadn't bothered to examine its contents. Why would he? It was just another example of the obsessive organization that he'd dismissed as irrelevant. I slipped the folder into my purse and continued my performance of searching for personal items. Jessica watched from a distance, checking her watch periodically. When I announced that I'd found everything I needed, she seemed relieved. The security guard escorted me back to the lobby, and within 20 minutes of arriving, I was back in my car with the evidence I needed to destroy Richardson's life. That evening, I spread the documents across my kitchen table and began the process of verification. Each invoice I'd copied represented a potential violation of federal tax law. Each phantom employee was a felony charge waiting to happen. Each duplicate expense claim was evidence of systematic fraud that had been operating for years. But I knew that having evidence wasn't enough. I needed to present it in a way that would be taken seriously by the IRS, and I needed to do it without revealing my identity until I was ready to face the consequences of my actions. Over the next week, I became a student of federal tax law and IRS whistleblower procedures. I read everything I could find about how to report tax fraud, what documentation was required, and what protections were available for people in my situation. I learned about Form 211, the official IRS whistleblower complaint form, and about the reward system that compensated individuals who provided information leading to successful tax fraud prosecutions. The reward system was particularly interesting. The IRS paid between 15% and 30% of any additional taxes, penalties, and interest collected as a result of whistleblower information. Given the scope of Richardson's fraud, which I estimated had cost the government hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes over the past 3 years, the potential reward was substantial. But money wasn't my primary motivation. I wanted Richardson to understand that his actions had consequences, that treating people as disposable had a price, and that his assumption of intellectual superiority over his employees had been catastrophically wrong. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing my case. I organized the documents chronologically, created a detailed timeline of the fraudulent activities, and wrote a comprehensive summary that explained how Richardson's scheme worked and how it could be verified through official records. I cross-referenced client names with public business filings, confirmed the non-existence of phantom employees through Social Security Administration records, and documented the paper trail that connected Richardson's internal books to his clients' tax returns. The process was meticulous and time-consuming, but I found it deeply satisfying. Every hour I spent building the case was an hour spent regaining control over my situation. Every document I verified was another nail in Richardson's professional coffin. Every connection I made between his fraudulent activities and their legal consequences was a step toward justice. During this time, I also began documenting my own employment history at Richardson & Associates. I gathered copies of performance reviews, email communications, and project completions that contradicted Richardson's claims of incompetence. I wasn't planning to use this information immediately, but I wanted to be prepared for any attempts to discredit my whistleblower report by attacking my credibility. The irony was delicious. Richardson had fired me for being too thorough, too detail-oriented, too concerned with accuracy and compliance. Now, those same qualities were being weaponized against him with surgical precision. 3 weeks after my termination, I was ready to file my whistleblower report. I'd completed Form 211, assembled a comprehensive evidence package, and prepared a detailed narrative that walked the IRS through Richardson's fraudulent activities step by step. The package was over 200 pages long, meticulously organized, and professionally presented. But before I submitted it, I wanted to see Richardson one more time. I wanted to look him in the eye and remember exactly why I was doing this. I wanted to confirm that he hadn't experienced any last-minute attacks of conscience or sudden improvements in character. I wanted to make sure he deserved what was coming. I drove to his office building on a Thursday afternoon and parked across the street. From my car, I could see the windows of Richardson & Associates on the 3rd floor. I watched employees move back and forth past the windows, going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their employer was operating a criminal enterprise that would soon be exposed. At 5:30, Richardson emerged from the building. He was walking with a client, a middle-aged man in a conservative suit who looked like he ran a small manufacturing business. They shook hands on the sidewalk, and I watched Richardson's performance of professional competence and ethical business practices. He smiled, nodded, and projected exactly the kind of trustworthiness that had allowed him to operate his fraud for so long. After the client left, Richardson walked to his BMW and spent a few minutes on his phone. Even from a distance, I could see his body language change during the conversation. His shoulders tensed, his free hand gestured emphatically, and his expression became agitated. Someone was giving him information he didn't want to hear. When he finished the call, he stood beside his car for a moment, looking up at the windows of his office. There was something in his posture that suggested concern, maybe even worry. I wondered if he was beginning to suspect that his activities had been discovered, or if he was simply dealing with the normal stresses of running a criminal enterprise. As he drove away, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Richardson had no idea what was coming. He thought he was untouchable, protected by his professional reputation and the complexity of his fraudulent scheme. He thought he could destroy my career and face no consequences. He thought he was smarter than everyone around him, including the secretary he'd dismissed as incompetent. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The next morning, I drove to the IRS office downtown. The building was imposing, all concrete and glass, designed to project the authority of the federal government. I carried my evidence package in a briefcase, dressed in my best professional attire, and walked through the security checkpoint with the confidence of someone who had right on her side. The whistleblower intake process was surprisingly straightforward. I was directed to a small conference room where a special agent reviewed my Form 211 and evidence package. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, exactly the kind of person I'd hoped would be handling my case. She asked detailed questions about my employment history, my access to the documents, and my understanding of Richardson's business practices. I answered each question thoroughly, providing specific examples and referring to the supporting documentation in my evidence package. Her questions were probing but not hostile, and I could see her professional interest growing as she reviewed the scope of the fraud I was reporting. After 2 hours, she collected my materials and explained the next steps in the process. The IRS would conduct a preliminary review of my submission, verify the information through their own investigative resources, and determine whether to pursue a formal investigation. If they decided to move forward, I would be contacted for additional interviews and might be asked to provide testimony. She also explained the confidentiality protections available to whistleblowers and the anti-retaliation provisions that would protect me from further employment discrimination. I listened carefully, but I wasn't particularly concerned about retaliation. Richardson had already done his worst to me. The rest was just paperwork. Walking back to my car, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in months. The evidence was in the hands of people who could act on it. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Richardson's fate was no longer in his own hands. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one more move to make. Over the next several weeks, I monitored Richardson and Associates from a distance. I drove by the office building occasionally, checked their website for updates, and kept an eye on local business news for any mention of accounting firm investigations. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but I knew that IRS investigations moved slowly and quietly. They would be verifying my information, cross-referencing it with their own records, and building their own case before making any public moves. During this time, I also began my job search in earnest. I updated my resume, highlighting my organizational skills, attention to detail, and experience with financial document management. I was careful not to mention the circumstances of my departure from Richardson and Associates, instead focusing on my accomplishments and the value I could bring to a new employer. The job search was challenging but not impossible. My skills were transferable, and my experience was relevant to many different types of businesses. I had several promising interviews and received 2 job offers within a month of beginning my search. I accepted a position with a small law firm that specialized in business litigation, a job that would allow me to use my organizational skills in a more intellectually stimulating environment. My new employer was impressed by my thoroughness and professionalism. They had no idea that I'd recently brought down a major tax fraud scheme, and I saw no reason to enlighten them. I was simply a skilled professional who had left her previous job to pursue new opportunities. My references from Richardson and Associates were glowing, written before my termination, and submitted as part of my employment file. 6 weeks after I filed my whistleblower report, I received a call from the IRS special agent who had handled my case. She asked me to come in for a follow-up interview, explaining that their investigation had confirmed the validity of my allegations, and they were preparing to move forward with formal enforcement action. The second interview was more intense than the first. I was questioned by a team of agents and attorneys who wanted to understand every detail of Richardson's operation. They had expanded their investigation beyond the evidence I'd provided, uncovering additional fraudulent activities that stretched back even further than I'd realized. They showed me documents I'd never seen before, transactions that had been conducted through shell companies and offshore accounts. Richardson's scheme was more sophisticated and far-reaching than I'd understood. My evidence had been the key that unlocked a much larger criminal enterprise. The agents explained that they were coordinating with the Department of Justice on potential criminal charges against Richardson and several of his associates. They were also pursuing civil penalties that could result in millions of dollars in fines and back taxes. My role as a whistleblower had been crucial to their investigation, and they were grateful for my cooperation. As I left the IRS building that day, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Richardson had called me incompetent, dismissed my concerns as ignorance, and destroyed my career to protect his criminal activities. But my supposed incompetence had been his downfall. My attention to detail, my thorough documentation, and my refusal to ignore obvious problems had exposed him to the full force of federal law enforcement. The public revelation came 3 months later. I was having coffee in my kitchen when the morning news reported that Richardson and Associates had been raided by federal agents. The camera showed boxes of documents being carried out of the building, employees being questioned, and Richardson himself being led away in handcuffs. The news anchor described the charges: tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The investigation had revealed a multi-year scheme to defraud the government of millions of dollars in unpaid taxes. Multiple clients had been victimized, their trust exploited to facilitate Richardson's criminal activities. I watched the coverage with a cup of coffee in my hands, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Richardson's professional reputation was destroyed. His business was finished. His freedom was in jeopardy. And it had all started with the concerns of a secretary he'd dismissed as incompetent. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story the next day, featuring interviews with former employees and clients. Several people mentioned that they'd noticed irregularities in Richardson's business practices, but had been afraid to speak up. One former employee, who'd been fired 6 months before me, said he'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to report it. Jessica, the receptionist I'd trained, was quoted in the article expressing shock and disbelief. She said Richardson had always seemed professional and ethical, and she couldn't understand how she'd missed the signs of criminal activity. Reading her comments, I felt a pang of sympathy. She'd been as much a victim of Richardson's deception as anyone else. But my sympathy was tempered by the knowledge that Richardson's victims would receive justice. The IRS had recovered millions of dollars in unpaid taxes and penalties. His clients would be compensated for their losses, and the legal system would hold him accountable for his crimes. 2 weeks after Richardson's arrest, I received a letter from the IRS whistleblower office. It was a formal notification that my submission had resulted in a successful enforcement action, and I was entitled to a reward under the federal whistleblower program. The amount was substantial, more than my annual salary at Richardson & Associates, but it felt like a secondary benefit to the primary satisfaction of seeing justice served. I used part of the reward money to pay off my student loans and build an emergency fund. The rest I donated to a legal aid organization that helped workers who'd been wrongfully terminated. It seemed like an appropriate way to honor the experience that had led me to this moment. 6 months after Richardson's arrest, I read that he had pleaded guilty to all charges and been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. His business assets had been seized to pay restitution to his victims. His professional license had been permanently revoked. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The man who had called me incompetent was now a convicted felon, his career and freedom sacrificed to protect a criminal enterprise that had been exposed by the very person he'd dismissed as irrelevant. I never spoke to Richardson again after that morning in the conference room when he fired me. I never confronted him about his crimes or revealed my role in his downfall. I simply went about my life, building a new career and putting the experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I would think about that moment when he'd smiled as he destroyed my career. I would remember the casual cruelty in his voice when he'd dismissed my concerns as incompetence. I would recall the satisfaction in his eyes when he'd told security to escort me from the building. And I would smile, knowing that his arrogance had been his downfall. He'd underestimated the secretary he'd called incompetent, and that mistake had cost him everything. The incompetent secretary had brought down a criminal empire, and Richardson would have 7 years in federal prison to reflect on the irony. Justice, it turned out, was a dish best served with meticulous documentation and unwavering attention to detail. Qualities that Richardson had dismissed as irrelevant were the very qualities that had destroyed him. I was no longer the secretary they'd called incompetent. I was the whistleblower who'd exposed their crimes, the witness who'd testified to their guilt, and the professional who'd moved on to better things. And Richardson? He was just another number in the federal prison system, serving time for the arrogance that had made him believe he was untouchable. The last time I drove past his old office building, it was empty, a for lease. Sign hung in the window where Richardson & Associates had once operated. The business was gone, the employees had found other jobs, and the clients had moved on to honest accountants. But I was still there, still working, still paying attention to details that others might miss, still competent, despite what they'd called me. And that was the most satisfying revenge of all.